We pray. Amen. All right, we're in Matthew 24. And we talked a little bit about the beginning of this. The questions that were asked: when will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming? And what will be the sign of the end of the age? So basically 3 questions at the beginning of 24. It was, of course, talking about Jerusalem. That was the start of this, when he looked upon Jerusalem and said that it would be destroyed. He said that, and I think more importantly, and the part we miss in this, and let me back up to that, is in the end of 23, in verse 38. Your house is being left to you desolate. You know, I think that's something we really, really miss in this passage, but it's just so, so, so important. The idea that that house is empty, you know, and that's something we just can't, you can't get. I don't know why, I've got all these things lately. I've been getting all these things lately about Israel, and it just infuriates me, you know. I guess the older I get, the more infuriated I get about it. But it just infuriates me that we think that there's 2 ways to God. You know, I just don't understand how people can read the Bible and come away with that idea that, you know, Israel is still a thing. You know, it's just, you know, physical Israel. You know, Jesus, when he was crucified on the cross, he negated the sacrifice. Sacrifice in the temple no longer had any effect. When Jesus was sacrificed on the cross, the sacrifice of the temple became obsolete. There was no use in it, no purpose in it anymore. Their house was desolate. God didn't dwell there anymore. And I think that's so, so important with Jesus, because they were so looking for the physical destruction of Jerusalem, and that's going to happen. I mean, that's what this is about, and that's going to happen. In 71 AD, Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. The temple is going to be destroyed, no doubt about that. But what we have to understand is that Jerusalem was destroyed basically when Jesus died on that cross. The idea of Israel as a nation ceased to exist when Jesus died on that cross. It ceased. Their house was desolate. It was no longer of any use. And so before Jerusalem was ever physically destroyed, it was of no use. There was no value in it. And we forget that. They ceased to exist when Jesus died on that cross. And you know, and even though here they're looking towards a physical destruction of Jerusalem, but it's just so infuriating to me. I read a thing from a rabbi the other day, and he was talking about the idea of, which I see the validity of his point, the idea that nowhere in the Old Testament, nowhere in Judaism, does it say that Jesus would come again, come multiple times. He says, in Judaism, the Jewish thought of the Messiah, I thought this was kind of interesting, but the Jewish thought of the Messiah was that he comes one time and takes care of it. There's not a second time. And I thought that's really, really interesting, because that's the way I see it too. But the way he sees it is that he's going to come one time to restore a physical Israel, a physical kingdom, where I see it as Jesus was coming one time to start a spiritual kingdom. But I agree with the one time. You know, but I thought that was interesting, because so many people, Christians, are looking for the second coming, which we understand the end of time. I'm not saying Jesus won't come again to end all things, but he's not going to come to earth again. You know, and so many Christians are looking for that, and yet in Judaism, their theory is that that's nowhere in Scripture. You know, it's one time. So this was the one time. You know, we're not waiting for another time on earth. This was the one time, and I thought that was interesting when I read that. I thought that was an interesting thought, because I really hadn't thought about that from an Old Testament perspective of what the Old Testament says about Jesus. But if you really look at what the Old Testament says, Jesus is a one-time thing. You know, it's not a multiple thing, it's a one-time thing. And I thought that was kind of interesting. And we started down through some of this about the whole world, and it was the whole world to them. We're not waiting for the gospel to be preached to the entire globe, as we saw it from the spacecraft this week. As far as they were concerned, it had gone into the whole world, and that's what Jesus said. We believe this is a generational thing. He's talking here about fleeing. It'd be better if you're not pregnant, because you're going to have to run. We talked about the 70 weeks of Daniel a little bit, which was probably confusing to a lot of people, but the 70 weeks of Daniel is 490 years. And if you read the prophecy of Daniel, it says the last week. It separates it, the 69 weeks and the last week. And so in the rapture theory or premillennialism, the basic thought, and I think this is, if you ever talk to somebody that believes in premillennialism, the simple answer, the simple response to it is, do you think that God fails? Because for premillennialism to be a thing, God had to fail. Christ had to fail. You got to remember that. Because the whole idea of premillennialism is that Jesus came and that the Jews rejected him and hung him on a cross, and then God, because of his failure, God put this big gap in here, and he's going to come back and try again. That's the whole theory of premillennialism in a nutshell. If he would have accomplished it the first time, if he would have been an earthly king and restored Israel, then it would have all been good, but that didn't work. So we put this stopgap measure in place because there's no gap in Daniel's prophecy. Daniel's prophecy is 69 weeks and a week. Daniel didn't say it was going to be 69 weeks, 2,500 years, and then another week. So there's no gap in the prophecy. So if you take, this was a man-made idea. I'm just trying to tell you. This was a man-made idea. It's not right. Doesn't fit the Bible. We get it out of scattered places, 1 Thessalonians 4, Revelation 20, but it's a scattered deal, and it doesn't work. But that's the theory of premillennialism. But it all centers around the 70 weeks of Daniel. Everything centers around the 70 weeks of Daniel when it comes to Christ. So the basic view then is, okay, so if you read that prophecy in Daniel, it says that in the middle of the last week, the sacrifice will cease. That's the prophecy, okay? In the middle of the last week, the sacrifice will cease. So, because of that prophecy of Daniel, you have to because of that prophecy of Daniel, you have to get, hold on a second. Just hold on a second. It's Daniel's prophecy that messes. Just hold on one second. So the idea in Daniel, he has this vision, right? And this vision he gets from this angel, because Daniel is concerned, right? Daniel's concerned about the rebuilding of Jerusalem, because what you got to understand about Daniel is he's a captivity prophet. So Daniel gets carried off by the Babylonians and winds up in Babylon, gets renamed Belshazzar, becomes a good Babylonian, and Daniel gets carried off, and then the Medes come in. And when the Medes come in, the Babylonians just kind of give it to the Medes. They don't fight it, you know. They just kind of give it to them because the Medes were so powerful that the Babylonians didn't want to try to challenge them at all. They didn't want to try to challenge what they were doing or what they said. So when the Babylonians came in, Jeremiah the prophet had said that when Israel got carried off by the Babylonians, in 70 years they would return to Jerusalem. That was the prophecy of Jeremiah. So Jeremiah said, in 70 years you'll return to rebuild Jerusalem. And Daniel knew it was close to 70 years. So Daniel basically said, wanted to know when that was going to happen, which is going to happen. They're going to rebuild it, okay? So in Daniel 9, I'll read this to you. This is what all this stems around. Rapture, all that stuff stems around this little bit of prophecy in Daniel 9. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people in your holy city, to finish the wrongdoing, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for guilt, to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up vision and prophecy. So 70 weeks have come to do all that. Yeah. Daniel 9:24 is where this starts. So you are to know and understand that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So it's 69 weeks, okay? 7 weeks and 62 weeks. From the decree, this is a very specific prophecy. Most prophecy in the Old Testament isn't real specific, but this is pretty specific. So it says, you are to know and understand that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, and it will be built again with streets and moat, even in times of distress. That's the first part of this prophecy. So, the decree to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, 457 BC, that was issued by Xerxes. He said, Ezra went to him and said he wanted to go and rebuild the temple. And he said, okay, you can see that was the difference between the Babylonians and the Medes. The Babylonians they wanted to make everybody Babylonians. They were an assimilating conqueror. But the Medes weren't. The Medes said, if you want to go home, go home. So they did. So a lot of them did, and a lot of them didn't. That's what kind of gets us in this quandary in the Old Testament. Esther was under a Persian king, right? She was under a Persian king. So what that means is that Esther could have went back to Jerusalem. You see, in the book of Esther, you know that book Mordecai was going to write, and the whole book of Esther? Esther could have just went back to Jerusalem. Esther wasn't captive in a foreign land. Esther and Mordecai and all them Jews had decided to remain there. They weren't held there. And that kind of should change your view of Esther a little bit. But so Esther could have just went home, what I'm trying to say. Mordecai and Esther could have just went home, right? So, because they were in that culture. But the decree to rebuild, now there's a little bit of controversy about exactly when that decree, what year. There's a lot of, could have been here, could have been there. But the basic premise is that if you go from whatever year that was, basically, if you go that period of time, so 69 weeks is 483 years in this prophecy, okay? Yeah. Because 70 weeks is years. So 70 weeks is 490 years. 7 times 7 is 49. That's how the prophecy works. I don't know how we know that, but I know that's how it works. So it's 490 years. So if you go 69 weeks, which is 483 years, this gets a lot. We could talk about this all day, but Jesus probably was crucified in about 27 AD. Why do we know that? Because, and that's what I'm saying, this could shift a year or two, because we don't exactly know Jesus was crucified. We don't exactly know 457, I don't think, was the year, but this could shift on what I'm trying to say, a year or two. So Jesus, okay, so Herod the Great died in 4 BC. That we know. We know that for a fact. And the reason we know that for a fact is because there was a solar eclipse the year that Herod the Great died. And we know there was a solar eclipse in 4 BC. So Herod the Great died in 4 BC. So that means your calendar, our calendar, the Gregorian, we're on the Gregorian, right? The Gregorian calendar, which was set by the monk Dionysius, is off a little. So 0 is not 0, what I'm trying to tell you. So Jesus wasn't born in 0 AD or 1 AD. Jesus had to be born before the death of Herod the Great, because we know Herod the Great was in power when Jesus was born. We know that because Herod the Great issued the decree to kill all the male children from 2 years old and under. And then when Herod died, the wise men went to the child in the house, and then the angel appeared to Joseph and said, take the child into Egypt, right? And then when Herod died, the angel came and said, now go back to Nazareth. So we know Herod the Great was in power when Jesus was born. The Bible tells us Jesus began his ministry at 30 years old. So this can get, I'm actually studying this right now, this exact year when Jesus was born, because it's significant. Because when Jesus is teaching in the temple in Nazareth, he quotes Isaiah where he says it's a favorable year of the Lord, okay? I think that's significant because a favorable year of the Lord should be the year of Jubilee. And if it's the year of Jubilee, then we can actually figure out the year, because Jubilee was every 40 years. So we can, anyway, I'm not done with this study, but I'm in the middle of it. So basically, it puts Jesus to like 27 in that area, 27 AD. There's other reasons that matters, because Passover, if you take a Catholic view of Easter, Passover had to fall on the Sabbath, on Saturday. Passover would have had to fall on Saturday. For the traditional view of Easter to be true, Passover had to fall on Saturday. Do we understand? Do you understand what I'm trying to say here? Passover would have had to been on Saturday. If you take the traditional Friday to Sunday view of Easter, Passover would have had to have been on Saturday, because that would have been the Passover. That would have been the day they waited for Jesus. Anyway, I don't know if you're following me on this, but if you take the traditional view of Easter, Friday to Sunday, the theory of that is Passover had to fall, the Passover Sabbath, because Passover is a Sabbath too. Passover Sabbath and Sabbath, which would have been Saturday, had to be on the same day. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Can't do it. It doesn't work. So in order for that to happen, Jesus had to die on a certain year, because Passover Sabbath is a date, not a day. Are y'all following me on this? Right, but in the traditional view, the high day Sabbath and Sabbath would have had to been on that one day. Traditionally, that's how that would have had to work. If you take the Catholic view of Easter, that's how that had to work. That's what I was taught my whole life. It was a high Sabbath because it was on Sabbath. So it was a high Sabbath. It was Sabbath and Sabbath. It was Passover Sabbath and Sabbath on the same day, basically. Does that make any sense? That's what had to happen. But I don't agree with the traditional view. But when you place Jesus dying, it changes the day of Passover Sabbath, you see. If Jesus died on another year, it's just like Christmas to us. Christmas is on the 25th of the month, but it's on a different day every year. You understand what I'm saying? So depending on how you look at the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus, that matters on what year he died, because it matters when the Passover Sabbath and the regular Sabbath lines up. Because the Bible says that the women, I know I'm getting off track, but you got to understand this really is a big study. The women that were, remember what they did? You remember the story? The women went and got the spices, right? And then they prepared them and rested on the Sabbath, remember? And then they went to the tomb. Remember that? So in other words, it doesn't really work to think that Saturday was the day, because I just don't see how they can do that, because they couldn't have got the spices and then rested on the Sabbath, because Jesus was put in the tomb right at dark on, well, we would say Friday. I don't agree with that. But right on dark before Passover Sabbath. I'll leave it that way, because the Bible says that they wanted them off of the cross before dark, because it was Sabbath, right? They wanted them off the cross before dark. And it says the women were at the tomb and watched Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus put Jesus in the tomb. It says the women were there watching. So there's no way they could have went right at dark from the tomb back to Jerusalem, because Got to remember, Sabbath starts at sundown. Sabbath starts at sundown. They couldn't have went and got the spices and then prepared them and took the time to prepare them and then rested on the Sabbath. There wasn't time for them to do that. And that's what the Bible says. They rested on the Sabbath. They rested on the Saturday Sabbath, you see. Anyway, point is, we could shift this a couple of years either way, depending on when we say Jesus, the Sabbath that Jesus was crucified. Does that make any sense? Passover Sabbath, okay? Of what? Well, because to me the significance is that I just want to basically prove the Catholics wrong, but you know, I think that the reason that and I probably shouldn't say it that way, but the reason it's significant to me is because, well, that's part of it, you know, and that argument is just old, you know, and the idea, because the traditional view of Jesus' death is this. Jesus says, this is what doesn't fit to me, okay? Jesus said, I'm going to be 3 days and 3 nights in the earth. Jesus said, he says, no sign will be given to you but the sign of Jonah. As Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth. All my life, it was 3 days. And the way they do it, and this is because in Judaism, as you've probably heard a million times, you know, any part of a day is considered a day, and their days begin at sunset. So, in the traditional view, Jesus was technically in the tomb before sunset on Friday. So they count Friday as an entire day. Then he was in the tomb from Friday night to Saturday evening. That's another day. And then he came out of the tomb Sunday morning after sunrise, which is the 3rd day. But there's no way in that you can get 3 days and 3 nights. I don't care how you do it. It's not possible because you got Friday night, you got Saturday night. I can buy the 3 days in a way. Friday before dark, Saturday day, and Sunday after sunrise. But there's another problem with this. Mary Magdalene came to the tomb while it was still dark and the tomb was empty. So Jesus wouldn't come up after sunrise on Sunday morning, according to the Bible. So then I thought, well, how do they reconcile that? So then I had to go on a study of when do the Jews consider it to be the next day? When do the Jews consider it to be daylight? And then I found out that's not very simple either, because nothing in Judaism is simple. There's 3 different ways they look at daylight, and 3 different words for that. So one of the 2 most common things is this. One is, it's daylight when the sun comes above the horizon. Now to me, that's daylight. When the sun comes above the horizon, that's daylight. But their other view is that it's daylight when you can recognize somebody. So that puts it like, according to them, 27 minutes before daylight. Now I don't know how far apart you got to be to recognize somebody, but apparently when it's daylight enough that if me and Buck met each other, I'd know it was Buck, that's daylight. So their theory is Jesus came out before the sun actually came above the horizon, but it was still Sunday morning, which I don't know how they get that. So what I'm trying to say is there's a whole lot of stuff about that doesn't make any sense to me. And it didn't say Jesus would be in the tomb for 3 days. If it had said 3 days, I could almost buy it. But it said, I'll be in the tomb 3 days and 3 nights. And I don't care how you keep time. I don't care if day and night's the same. I don't care how you judge a day. A day and a night, and I can agree any part of a day would be a day. I'm fine with that. I mean, if you show up, you know, Sunday at noon, I still saw you Sunday. I mean, I can buy that. But I don't get 3 days and 3 nights. I can't get 3 days and 3 nights out of that no matter how hard I try. You just can't get 3 nights. But then the other kick is this. So then they say, well, if you put him crucified and you move the Sabbath back, and then if he came out of the tomb on Sunday morning, that would be risen on the 4th day instead of the 3rd day. And Jesus said, I'll arise on the 3rd day. But then I'm thinking, but if Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and it was still dark, then technically Jesus did rise on the third day, because they keep telling me they count their time from sunset to sunrise or whatever, and he came out before, so it would have been the third day. Even though it was in the middle of Sunday night, it still would have been the third day, right? Anyway, I'm just trying to tell you, this is quite the mess. Back to Daniel. So there's a lot to think about here. But then I try to put you back to Daniel. So that's after that. So we know Jesus is going to come in this time frame. We know it's got to be before 30 A.D. because Jesus ministry was 3.5 years long, we think. 3 years. We get that from John's gospel because there's 3 Passovers in John's gospel. So that puts the ministry of Christ at 3 years. 3.5, we call it. 3.5, because he actually started. Because the first miracle was in John 2, right? Turning the water into wine in John 2. That was when he was on the way for the first Passover. So we say 3.5 years. He started before the first Passover, and he's going to be crucified at the third Passover. So we say 3.5 years. Jesus' ministry, he began, it said, when he was 30 years old. So Jesus was about 33 or so when he was crucified on the cross, right? So if he started his ministry at 27, 3.5 years would be 31. Don't exactly take those dates to be right. That's what I'm trying to tell you, but it's close. So 31 would be the end, because he started at 30. He had to have been born. See, I'm going to shift that back a little, but he had to have been born, in the 4 BC range, which would have put about 27, because you don't have a 0 year. Remember that? You don't have a 0 year, right? So that puts it about 27. And then 3.5 years in, he's going to get crucified. So that puts his crucifixion around 31. Close. So nobody denies that part of it. Nobody denies that part of it. Even premillennialists. We all put that crucifixion at 3.5. So nobody denies that. But then it's the second week. Now, see, they put Jesus coming at the end, but then they separate that week. So here's the other problem with this. So Daniel's prophecy that I just read to you was, I got to go a little further now. So that's when Jesus comes, 60. So then it says, then after the 62 weeks, so this is at the crucifixion, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood, even to the end. So after this time, the Messiah will be cut off, nothing to do, let's see, and he will confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. That's the last week. We're talking about the last week. So Jesus comes, things change, but then listen. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come the one who makes desolate, until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, gushes forth on the one who makes desolate. This is where it gets confusing. So in the middle of the week, the sacrifice will cease. Okay? We know that. The rest of it is a little more muddy. But in the middle of the week, the sacrifice will cease. So the idea of premillennialism is this. We haven't had the last week. That's the idea of premillennialism. The last week has not happened yet. We still got to have that last week. So in order for that to happen, the last week, some things have to happen. One is the sacrifice has to cease. Well, that's a problem because we're not sacrificing. Jews haven't sacrificed since 70 AD. So the temple's got to be rebuilt, which is a problem because there's a Muslim mosque on the Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock. So that's going to have to be torn down. The temple's going to have to be rebuilt, and the sacrifice has got to start again so the sacrifice can cease. And if you don't believe me, listen to Bot Radio. Those guys, they love this stuff. And they're going to be telling you. I was listening the other day, and that guy says, we already got a warehouse, and we're rebuilding all the articles of the temple and getting ready to put all them back in there and start the sacrifice again. So they got to restart the sacrifice. Then the abomination that causes desolation has got to stand in the holy place. I'm not going to get into that prophecy today. The abomination that causes desolation has to stand in the holy place, and the sacrifice has got to cease. And then, at the end of that week, the other 3.5 years have to happen. And then, if you're premillennialist, then Jesus is going to retake the throne. He's going to have this great battle. He's going to right all these wrongs. And then you're going to have a 1,000-year reign. That's the idea of premillennialism. That's exactly, yeah. What you got to remember is this whole premillennialist theory is really new. It's not old. It's not even 100 years old. But the reason this happened is because of Revelation. Because Revelation, I know Bill just did Revelation with you, but what you have to understand about the book of Revelation is there's 3 predominant views about the book of Revelation. And maybe we don't talk about that enough, but there's three views about the book of Revelation. We talk about the one in here because that's kind of the view we believe, and I believe, and that's what we teach. And that's that Revelation's about the Roman Empire. That's been the predominant view in the Church of Christ for the last 40 years probably. But you got to remember that wasn't always the predominant view in the Church of Christ. The predominant view in the Church of Christ 50 years ago, or 60, was that Revelation was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, not the fall of the Roman Empire. Foye Wallace, who is one of my favorite Church of Christ preachers of all time, Foye Wallace wrote a whole book on that. Foye Wallace firmly believed that Revelation was about the destruction of Jerusalem, not about Rome. So that's one view. So one view of Revelation is it's about the Roman Empire. We call that, and the other view is that it's about the destruction of Jerusalem. And both of those views are called preterist views. In other words, they believe that Revelation has already occurred. Basically, it's historical. It's not prophecy. It's historical. It's a preterist view. I'm kind of a modified preterist because I believe it's about Rome, but I also believe that towards the end, Revelation 21 is talking about the end of time, great white throne judgment, end of the world, end of time. So I'm kind of a modified preterist. I don't take the whole thing as being past, but I take the bulk of it as being past. Some people take the entire thing, including the white throne judgment of Revelation 21, to all be historical. The third view of Revelation is prophetic, which means that most of it hasn't happened. The great battle of Armageddon, all that stuff hasn't occurred yet. The reason that view came into prominence, if you'll research it, was actually because of a Catholic monk. Because for a long time in the Bible, when I was young, maybe some of you are old enough maybe to remember some of those sermons way back, but there was a point in history where the Antichrist and the beast and all that was considered to be Rome, the Catholic Church. There was a time in history where that was the very prominent view, was that was all the Catholic Church, because the Reformation came in, Protestants came in, they were all against Catholicism, and they wanted to basically bash the Catholic Church. So what they did was they said the beast is the Roman Catholic Church. And these emperors, these rulers were popes, and that the Antichrist was going to be a pope, right? That all this was about Catholicism and how Catholicism was evil and bad and evil, and Revelation, all those things was about the Roman Catholic Church. So a monk came along and he decided he would shift that view. So he's the one that came up with this premillennialist idea, basically. And then it got published in a study Bible and it gained traction. But then when the United States went in and threw all those Palestinians out and made Israel a nation, it really gained traction. because people thought, oh, well, Israel's a nation again now. We can see the temple being rebuilt. We can see Jews coming back into power. We can see the Jewish nation rising again. And so it gave traction to this doctrine. But now that we're having all these wars in the Middle East, and all these things are going on with Israel and Iran and the West Bank and all these other things that's going on, it feeds fuel to these people who are saying, oh, that's the doctrine, right? Israel's going to rise up again, and they're going to throw these Muslims out, and they're going to rebuild the temple, and all this stuff's going to start again. So it gave traction to this view. 48, yeah, made a nation state in 48. So all that gained traction. But I think Rex's humble view is that when Jesus died on that cross at the middle of the last week, the sacrifice ceased. I know the temple was still there. I know they were still sacrificing animals on the temple, but it didn't matter anymore. The sacrifice effectively ceased at 3.5. When Jesus died on that cross, the sacrifice, in my opinion, ceased. No longer had any effect. Didn't matter anymore. The sacrifice ceased. And then, in 3.5 years, the gospel goes out into the whole world. Stoning of Stephen, we call that the Dispersia. Everybody went out to their own place and took the gospel to the whole world. So in my opinion, the 70 weeks of Daniel has been fulfilled. If you're premillennialist, you're still waiting for the last week. That's the best way I know to tell you this in a nutshell. 90% of Christians in the United States are probably premillennialists. Whether or not they understand it or not, they probably are. So that's how that breaks down. I know that's a lot, and I've tried to make it make sense, and I probably didn't, but are there any questions? Daniel's prophecies were so good that people think Daniel was written after the fact, you know. It's kind of interesting. Anyway, no comments, huh? You'll leave that alone. So that gets us back to Luke. When Jerusalem is surrounded by armies, you know, get out of town, right? To me, that's the abomination that causes desolation. That's the symbol of the Roman Empire, the eagle. That's what's on the standard of Rome. When that stands in the city, that's the time to leave. That's what I think that is, the abomination that causes desolation. I think it's the standard of Rome, the eagle. To me, that's what that means. It makes sense to me. But then he goes back into Matthew, pray that your flight, we're out of time. We're out of time. Okay. Starting here next week.